There are places in history whose names do not describe only a location. They describe a rupture. Not a country, but what humanity can become. Auschwitz was one of those places. Today, we are not going to look at this as the story of a single camp. Because Auschwitz was not just one point surrounded by barbed wire. It was a system that turned human life into records, categories, labor, and ultimately, death. And perhaps that is why the first question in this video has to be this. What was Auschwitz really? Most people think of Auschwitz as a single camp, but the reality was much larger. Auschwitz was the name of an extensive complex of interconnected camps. Auschwitz I was the first and central camp. It was where administrative control, discipline, and punishment were concentrated. Auschwitz II, Birkenau, became one of the largest centers of mass extermination. Auschwitz III-Monowitz was one of the key sites of forced labor, where human bodies were exploited for the needs of the war economy. That distinction matters, because Auschwitz was not simply a place where people were imprisoned. There was confinement here, there was hunger, there was forced labor, there was humiliation, and there was systematic death. So this was not just a camp, it was a mechanism. And that mechanism worked by stripping human beings, step by step, of identity, dignity, and finally, existence itself. But a mechanism like this does not appear on its own, which makes the second question even more important. How did something like this become possible? Auschwitz was not built in a day, and the mentality that made it possible was not born overnight either. First, people were targeted. Jews, Roma, people with disabilities, political opponents, homosexuals, and other groups unwanted by the regime were gradually pushed out of society. And this exclusion began in language. They stopped being neighbors. They stopped being citizens. They began to be described as danger, burden, and problem. That change may seem small, but it was one of the most critical stages. Because before you destroy a people, you must first weaken the habit of seeing them as human. The Nazi regime did this through propaganda. It did it through laws. It did it by redesigning everyday life. People were increasingly restricted from working, studying, owning property, and participating in public life. By the time the war began, hatred had already been organized. The war only gave that system a larger field to operate in. And then came the next stage, moving people into that system. Which brings us to the next question. How were people sent to Auschwitz? For many, the road to Auschwitz began inside a train car. People were taken from their cities, towns, and ghettos. Many did not know exactly where they were being sent. Some were told they were being taken to work. Others were told they were being relocated. Many took suitcases with them. They took documents. They took a few belongings for their children, because most of them did not know this was their final journey. Then came the train rides that lasted for days. Overcrowded wagons, thirst, suffocation, fear, disease. And when they arrived, they were met not with explanation, but with speed. Shouts, armed guards, dogs, searchlights. People were forced to move before they had time to think. That was the system's first move, to disorient, to separate, to control. And it was here that one of the camp's most terrifying moments began. A decision made in just a few seconds. The people arriving at Auschwitz were lined up. An officer or Nazi doctor would often look at them for only a few seconds. And those few seconds could determine a person's fate. Those who appeared young and fit enough to work were sent one way. The elderly, the sick, pregnant women, and those who looked weak or exhausted were sent another. This was not an evaluation. It was a cold decision about who would be sent to death immediately. And most of the time, it was made in only a few seconds. Families were torn apart here. A mother was separated from her child. A sibling saw another for the last time. A husband or wife disappeared within a few steps. before there was even time to understand what was happening. One of the most disturbing things about Auschwitz was this: death often did not arrive like screaming chaos. It arrived like an ordinary procedure. But what about those who were taken inside? This is where another chapter begins. What did life become for those who entered the camp? Those considered fit for work were allowed into the camp. But that did not mean they were saved. It only meant that the form of death had been delayed or changed. Their hair was cut. Their clothes were taken. Their belongings were confiscated. For many, a name became useless in the eyes of the system. In its place, there was a number. That detail is not small, because a name connects you to your past, your family, your identity. A number connects you to a record. Auschwitz operated as a system that first stripped people of their humanity and then registered them. The barracks were overcrowded, food was inadequate, water was dirty, disease was widespread, violence was routine. Forced labor was organized in a way designed to push the human body beyond its limits. Death here was not found only in the gas chambers. It was in hunger, it was in the cold, it was in exhaustion, it was in beatings, infection, sleeplessness, and constant fear. At Auschwitz, the system destroyed people sometimes all at once, and sometimes piece by piece. And yet, when we look back today, one of the things that affects people most is not only this process itself. There is another heavy chapter here. Why do the belongings left behind still speak so powerfully? Some of the most haunting images associated with Auschwitz are the suitcases, the shoes, the glasses, the children's clothes. Because these objects remind us that the people murdered here were not just numbers. A suitcase tells you that its owner believed they would return. A child's shoe says what large statistics cannot. A pair of glasses reminds us that someone was still looking at the world until the final moment. And these belongings were not simply left behind at random. They were collected, sorted, recorded, stored. This is where the chilling nature of Auschwitz becomes even clearer. This was not only the crime of hatred, it was also the crime of bureaucracy. There were lists, there were records, even what remained of human beings was absorbed into the system. And that leads to the next question. Why did Auschwitz become the most powerful symbol of the Holocaust? The Holocaust was not the story of a single place. Across Europe, there were ghettos, execution sites, other camps, other destructions. But Auschwitz became the most concentrated symbol of that entire structure, because here, the different faces of the Nazi system came together in one place. There was the concentration camp, there was the labor camp, there was mass extermination, there was logistics, there was record keeping, there was an organized machinery of death repeated over and over again. That is why Auschwitz did not remain only the name of a place. It became the name of a method, the name of how systematically human beings can build destruction against other human beings. Then the war moved toward its end. And another chapter opened. When liberation came, what was left behind? When Soviet forces reached Auschwitz in 1945, what remained was not simply an emptied camp. What remained was devastation on a scale that is difficult to measure. As they retreated, the Nazis tried to destroy much of the evidence. They emptied some structures. They forced many prisoners into death marches. And yet, what remained was enough to reveal the scale of what had happened. Empty barracks, piles of suitcases, shoes, hair, records, and survivors who had lived through more than a human being should ever have to endure. The word liberation sounds hopeful, but in the case of Auschwitz, it feels incomplete. Because for many survivors, freedom arrived at the same moment they had lost everything: their families, their homes, their past, and in some cases, even the person they once were. The camp was opened, but lives were not repaired. And this brings us to the final question. Why does Auschwitz still matter today? It is comforting to see Auschwitz as a horror that belongs only to the past. That way, we can imagine it as a closed file in history. But what made it possible was not only war. What made it possible was the idea that some human lives could be treated as less valuable than others. It was the normalization of hatred. It was the corruption of language. It was the use of law as a tool of exclusion. And it was the fact that large numbers of people either supported what was happening or failed to resist it enough. Great catastrophes rarely begin all at once. First, they become acceptable. Then people get used to them. Then they become ordinary. That is one of the harshest lessons Auschwitz leaves behind. To understand Auschwitz is not only to learn how many people died, it is to understand how a catastrophe of this scale could be made to look orderly, systematic, bureaucratic, and ordinary. Because what was destroyed, there was not only human life. Something else collapsed, too. The moral confidence humanity had in itself. That is why looking at Auschwitz is not easy. And it should not be easy. Because some places tell us more than history. They tell us what human beings can become, and what they must never become again.